Hi everyone, I'm the Rambling Photon, and today I would like to talk about memetics and some of my initial questions before I dive into more in-depth study of the subject. When I say memetics, I mean the study of cultural change over time and how culture spreads through memes. And by memes, I don't mean images that have different text on them that are funny or cute or whatever. When I say meme, I mean it in the more original sense of a cultural unit or a cultural idea. So it's a much broader sense of what a meme is than just it's an internet it's an internet funny or whatever. So what I think is my core question is what makes a culture successful? What are the metrics that we're using to determine that? And what values in a culture lead to that success? So before we get into any of that, I need to define my terms. So I've talked about how I think of memes as being broader. And I the way I think of it is that a meme is to memetics as a gene is to genetics. And I think of a culture as sort of the analog to a genetic species. So you have a memetic species, and you have subspecies and all that stuff. So you can think of Western culture as a memetic species or a cultural species. And you can think of, say, American culture as one of the subspecies, or a particular subculture of American culture to be a subspecies. And now the exact mechanisms of propagation between memes and genes are different, but I think sort of the broad categorizations can be useful tools in the discussion. So, as I said before, my core question is sort of what ideas, what memes make a culture successful? How do we define success? And I think success in cultural terms is much more difficult to define. So if we use this analogy and ask the parallel question, what makes a species successful? What metric do you use? And it's not exactly clear if you use, for example, number of individuals that are members of that species. That would lead you to a skewed result. For example, bacteria will win that pretty much no matter what. Take any species of bacteria, and you're going to have more than 7 billion of them in a particular species. But if you compare, say, biomass, human-controlled biomass is pretty big, and it's pretty obviously dominant. So I think there's a case to be made that we are the most successful species, at least at the moment. We'll see over time how that changes. But then there's a question, okay, well, so how do we apply that to culture? Do we say that the culture with the most people in it wins? And I think it becomes a little bit fuzzier. So that's something that is difficult to define and will be important for specific answers. And those I don't really have yet. The next question that I have is, are there memes and ideas that cannot coexist for extended periods? Now, there are memes, and by this I mean in the same culture. So, are there mutually exclusive ideas and cultural themes in a culture that prevent it from surviving? So I think that the answer is yes. But I'm not necessarily going to get into specific examples here yet. And then the other question is, are there memes or ideas that can exist but need to be paired with other specific memes or ideas in order to survive for any length of time? And I think the answer to that is also yes, but I don't know of any specific examples. So I'll be looking for those. Now back to a little bit of definition. So I think the sort of core examples of cultural success are relatively easy to define. So, but I think they're easier to define in the inverse. So we can define a cultural failure, or a failure of a culture, is cultural extinction. So if you have a culture that either wipes itself out or is wiped out by a different competing culture, then we can say that that culture has failed, or that culture is dead, right? And now a successful culture is one that at least has avoided extinction. So if it exists, it has some modicum of success. And that is something that I think, again, once you start trying to get beyond that, it gets much more difficult to define. Now, next, how do we define a cultural species? What is a cultural species or a memetic species? And I think the way that I would define this is by looking at the core values or the core ideas of that culture. And if you have two different sets of core values, then I would say that at least the culture is different subspecies, if not different species altogether. So once we've defined that, we get into some of the other questions that I'm interested in with regards to defining the culture war. So those questions are, what are our core values? In the United States, for example, what is the core value of the culture? And I think the problem is that there is not just one. The reason we have a culture war is that there are multiple different cultural subspecies within the US, and they're currently vying for control of the country in the sense of the government, and the wider culture as a whole, the culture of the future generations. So what our core values are, I think it is important in determining who will be successful in predicting who is going to ultimately win the culture war. Now, we haven't talked about how I think of how to ensure the success of a culture. Now, I think the most fundamental is to avoid the failure condition, right? So you don't want your culture to die out. Now, the way you do that is you need to replace people who either leave your culture or who die. So there are basically two ways to do that. There's either you can have more babies and then raise them in the culture with the core values of the culture that you're trying to have live, or you can convert others who are not currently in the culture to be a part of your culture. That's basically it. Those are your two options. Now, if you're talking about winning a culture war with respect to an opponent, I suppose you could define winning as having more people than the other guy, or the other culture. But that's not as useful, I think, because then there's a trivial solution of, well, I'm just going to kill all of the people in the other culture and then I win. But that doesn't necessarily ensure your success, because you could go extinct as a culture for other reasons. Whether it's due to natural disaster or some other cultural entity. So that's not necessarily, I don't think that's the most useful part. So those are just some of my initial thoughts on sort of memetics and how I think of it, and the framework that I'm using. I'm going to be doing a little bit more research on the actual field of memetics and semiotics and other related topics to see if there's actually anybody who's already studied the questions that I'm asking, and what answers they offer. And if I can't find any answers that they offer, then I'll try and think about it and get some on my own. A lot of this is going to be sort of rambly, a priori, intellectual wankery, if you will. So if you're interested in that, I'll have more videos on the topic at future dates. Not sure when exactly. But in any case, this has been the Rambling Photon. Hope to catch you next time.